Well, we have new details from a phone call between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Biden. The president reportedly conveyed that he expects a significant de-escalation of the conflict today as mediators work desperately to negotiate a ceasefire. And this comes as multiple Israeli strikes killed at least 6 people across the Gaza Strip early today. So far, over 200 Palestinians and at least a dozen Israelis have been killed, and both sides include children among their dead. Meantime, pressure is increasing dramatically from international mediators and world leaders for a ceasefire. So former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, is here to discuss what is going on. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador. So we recently learned that President Biden spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today, and he conveyed his expectations that there would be a significant de-escalation today. Biden has certainly been criticized for not prioritizing the Israeli-Palestinian issues. What is your reaction to this new information about the nature of the phone call between Biden and Netanyahu?
Thank you, Marianne, for having me today. We have a very strong bond with the U.S., and the Prime Minister is speaking regularly with President Biden, and we appreciate the support we received from the U.S. At the UN a few days ago. But at the same time, we have to remember that Israel is still under fire. As we speak, rockets are flying into our cities, not only from the south, from Gaza, but also from Lebanon. 4 rockets were shelled into the northern part of Israel, and millions of Israelis had to seek shelter. And it is not pleasant. I can tell you from my personal experience that every night when I have to take my daughters and run to shelter, it is not an easy experience for any father. So our approach is very simple. If it will be quiet here in Israel, it will be quiet in Gaza. We should not apologize for defending ourselves. That's exactly what we are saying to our allies, including our closest ally, the U.S.
Mr. Ambassador, obviously as the former Israeli ambassador, can you explain to our audience how do you view this current violence happening between Israeli forces and Hamas? Because Israel's right to exist has been reiterated by the President of the United States and by other allies of Israel. But when folks see images of 5-month-old babies who've lost all their family members or children who've been wounded in these, what Israel calls surgical attacks, it's hard to stomach. Understanding, as you and others have stated, that Hamas sometimes uses human and civilian folks as shields. But how are you able to get around that at all, or not?
Vlad, I agree with you. It's a complicated situation, but that's where we live. It's a difficult region, and unfortunately, Hamas is not a state actor. It's a radical terrorist organization. They don't care about the people in Gaza. Actually, we care more. And as we speak, we actually supply fuel and medical supplies to the people in Gaza because we care about the people of Gaza. Hamas is doing exactly the opposite. They are committing a double war crime. They are targeting Israeli civilians, and at the same time, they are putting their civilians in the front line as human shields. That is disgusting. But that's Hamas, a vicious organization. And I want to remind you, Vlad, that this organization was the only organization that actually supported Al-Qaeda back in 9/11. So they don't look for peace, and there is no dispute about territory. We left Gaza in 2005. We don't have any Jewish communities or any presence of Israeli military in Gaza. We left Gaza 16 years ago, and still we see that they are busy with building rockets and missiles instead of fighting COVID and taking care of their own population.
International calls for a ceasefire have certainly been mounting, and there are some conflicting reports that one may be coming this Thursday. I want to ask you what the chances are that you think that could happen, but also, what needs to be done. You mentioned that if it's quiet in Israel, it will be quiet in Gaza. And that certainly addresses one element of this conflict. But even before this, just, a couple weeks ago, one of the things that we were seeing were a lot of clashes in the streets in Jerusalem, Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis fighting in the street. So clearly something else needs to be done, even if a ceasefire can be hammered out. What are the next steps?
So I served back in 2014 as Deputy Minister of Defense, and we had a similar cycle of violence. And after 50 days, we reached a ceasefire. And basically, we don't really negotiate with Hamas. Through mediators, there was an understanding that you have no violence anymore. We didn't start this cycle. We don't know exactly what were the reasons behind it. But as you mentioned, there were other places where we saw violence, and it all came from the same place, from the incitement against Jews, incitement against Israel. And unfortunately, it's not the first time in history that Arab leaders are using holy issues, holy sites, in order to incite against Jews and to provoke violence. By the way, it's working for them every time. Whenever they want to attract public attention, they say, we are attacking the Temple Mount, which is a lie, that we are not allowing them to pray on the Temple Mount, which is another lie. But actually it works because it brings people out to the streets and it provokes violence.
Mr. Ambassador, things have certainly changed with many of your Arab neighbors since, back when we were kids during the Camp David Accords between Prime Minister Begin and President Sadat. And in the last administration, they made some serious diplomatic efforts along with partners in Israel and in other Gulf nations to bring about some diplomatic agreements that we haven't, frankly, seen in a number of years. But have any of those agreements led to a kind of a working relationship where some of those partners can talk to people in Gaza? I haven't heard. In other words, I guess what I'm getting at is, it seems to me that back in 2014 we heard a lot from some of these neighbors in the region about the last time Israel and Hamas were fighting, and this time they've been sort of silent. And even with the Palestinian Authority, we haven't heard much in the way of expressing. I mean, I know that they have had some, but it hasn't reached the level that we saw back in 2014. So what kind of conversations is Prime Minister Netanyahu and others having with these other countries that you've now signed diplomatic agreements with?
We have a very strong bond with the countries you mentioned, and we signed 4 peace agreements. We are very proud of them. And by the way, they are worried about radical Islam, not less than us. It's a threat for themselves as well, and we discuss those issues with them. But we have to understand that the influence on what's happening in Gaza is very limited, because Hamas, it's not logical. They don't care about funds. They don't care about building education or infrastructure for their people. They care about terrorizing Israel. You look what they have today, 14,000 missiles. Imagine what they could have done with the money they spent to build the rockets and missiles. They could have changed Gaza by now. So also those moderate Arab countries, they know that it is impossible to negotiate with Hamas, to deal with Hamas, but they do share the concerns that we are thinking about. And I want to refer to the statement of the leader of the UAE, who said it very clearly to the leaders of Hamas. Enough with what you are doing to your own people. Start dealing with the problems instead of the incitement.
Ambassador, on Saturday, a building in Gaza City where the Associated Press has offices was targeted. People inside the building were given the heads up ahead of time. They were able to leave the building. Israel said that Hamas was working out of that building. Members of the Associated Press and other members of the media say they were unaware of anything like that. There's an Associated Press reporter. His name's Faris Akram. He's been writing a personal journal along with his reporting, and he said that that building was the only building where he felt safe, and now it's no longer there. I want to ask you, Israel says that it's provided information, evidence, if you will, about Hamas working within that structure, but still, do you think that this was a justifiable strike with the knowledge that journalists are working there, that it has been considered a safe place for journalists to work? Was it justifiable to bring that building down?
So we know it's very complicated to operate inside Gaza. It's complicated for non-profit organizations that come to support the poor people in Gaza, and it's very difficult for media outlets to operate in Gaza. But at the same time, when we have the intelligence that in this building you have activities of Hamas, and we have very good intelligence, we act, we take action, we level that building. But as you mentioned, we told everybody, not only the reporters, to evacuate the building. They had time to take out everything, the computers, and to move out. And I think in the future, those media outlets should check very carefully where they are placing their facilities. It's hard in Gaza. Everything is under the control of Hamas, but they should not be in the same building of Hamas. And by the way, anyone who will be a neighbor of Hamas should know that in a certain point, it can become a target.
Mr. Ambassador, obviously as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, you're aware that in 2017 there was a report by the United Nations, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, that used the term that Israel is operating as like an apartheid state. I know that Ambassador at the time, Nikki Haley, reacted strongly to that. I know that it wasn't the top members of the United Nations, but now we've also had this report from Human Rights Watch that is also using that terminology. What's your reaction as Human Rights Watch and other groups start to perceive Israel as an apartheid state because of what is happening with Hamas?
It is outrageous. You know, it's legitimate to criticize Israel and to criticize our actions, and we are open to discuss everything. But calling Israel an apartheid state, it shows that some of our enemies, they haven't been to Israel. We are a strong democracy, a moral democracy. We do our best to support our neighbors, to help them. And unfortunately, we deal with a terrorist organization. And I think it's the easiest thing to do is to come and to call Israel apartheid state. This is outrageous. But you know, it showed me, when I was at the UN, I always said to my adversaries, you don't have any other points to bring up or any evidence. It's so easy for you to throw mud at Israel and to blame us for everything at the UN. So I think when you don't have valid claims, that's what our enemies are doing. They are trying to label us and to bash us on the international arena. But I think even in this operation, and we regret the loss of every civilian, we proved the morality of our military, the morality of our government, and the fact that we actually call people and ask them to evacuate the buildings surrounding Hamas facilities. I'm not familiar with such actions of the US military or the European militaries. I think we are the only military in the world that take those steps.
Ambassador, one of the things that I spent some time covering the region back when I was at CNN, and just apart from my work there, I'm praying for peace because I have friends in Israel, I have friends on the West Bank, and I've said to so many people that the region is one of the most beautiful places on earth, and you can't even describe it with words. People have to see it to understand that. So I really, really hope if the readout that we received today from the Office of the President of the United States, in which he implored Prime Minister Netanyahu to find a solution by the end of today, I really hope that comes to bear.
Thank you, Vlad. We pray for peace 3 times a day, and we hope to go back to normal life, to be with our families, to prosper. And also we pray for the people in Gaza, that they will have a proper leadership that will take care of the future.
Ambassador Danny Danon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.